What does restoring 1 million hectares of habitat mean for Canadian wildlife?
This is the Earth Day Party Podcast with Shannon Burns and Sarah Christie. Get in, bestie. We're going to clean up the planet.
Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Earth Day Party. I'm Shannon.
And I'm Sarah.
And we are diving into conversations with different experts about the planet, sustainability, and what we can do to make a difference. And we are really talking to an expert today. I'm excited for this.
This is a big episode. This is a big episode for the Virgin Radio Earth Day Party because you might have heard Shannon at the end of our episodes talk about how every episode is in support of WWF-Canada.
Yeah, so we thought, what a better person to talk to than the head of WWF-Canada to find out where any donations that you might be making for the podcast are going and what really WWF does for endangered animals and so many other things across Canada.
Well, yeah, they've been working to protect wildlife and nature for more than half a century. I remember as a kid, my parents adopted, I think it was a gorilla for me for my birthday, and I was crying at the dinner table because I was so happy. I think I thought the gorilla was going to live with us or something. That was not the case, but their work has just been so instrumental globally that I'm sure you can say WWF and someone will have some connection to them in some way, right?
Should we introduce Megan, who we're talking to?
Absolutely. Megan Leslie is the president and chief executive officer at WWF Canada. So she launched their bold 10-year plan to regenerate Canada, which we learn all about in the conversation, so I won't spoil anything here. She's been with WWF Canada since 2016, but before that, she was a member of parliament representing Halifax for 2 terms, and during which she was a deputy leader of the official opposition, an environment critic, and vice chair of the government committee on environment and sustainable development.
So then during that time, Megan introduced a motion to ban plastic microbes, which led to a ban on the Canadian manufacture, sale, and importation of these products, which is so cool. She also expedited the creation of Sable Island National Park Reserve, so no stranger to conserving, preserving, and fighting for Canadian wildlife and nature. I get to interview a lot of celebrities with this job. I'm so lucky, but sometimes I get so nervous before we talk to people like this because I'm like, wow, you are doing so much for our planet, and you're just a very cool and very smart person, and that's exactly how I felt getting into this conversation.
Speaking of cool, over the weekend, so right after our interview with Megan, she climbed 1,776 stairs at the CN Tower because the World Wildlife Fund did their WWF's Climb for Nature, so she climbed the CN Tower. So she, I don't know, sometimes you hear these things and you're like, do the bosses really take part in their big projects? She did it. She posted videos afterwards.
And who else did it, Sarah?
I did it.
You did it. Yay.
And I will say that it was a lot more than 1,776 stairs. I don't know why they don't advertise that, but kudos to Megan because she sounds very busy. So the fact that she had time to train for that.
Totally. How are your legs feeling, though? You feeling okay?
They're okay. Yeah. Stretching turns out it works.
Oh, who knew? Another theory. Incredible. All right, let's get into this conversation with Megan and learn so much more about WWF.
And while you're listening, if you want to go to wwf.ca/Earth Month and you feel inspired to make a donation, we won't argue with that. Megan Leslie, what is the biggest threat to wildlife in Canada?
Yeah, here in Canada, I think most people don't think that there's an issue with wildlife and how they're doing because, we're so big. We're this huge country. We have the longest coastline in the world and all this space. So you kind of are like, oh, yeah, wildlife are probably okay in Canada. But at WWF Canada, we do a report every few years called the Living Planet Report Canada, and we assess wildlife populations. And I got bad news. Wildlife populations in Canada are not doing well. The numbers are in decline, some species in really steep decline. And so, I'm going to ask you, what do you think wildlife need in order if they're going to flourish and thrive?
We had a conversation with David Suzuki, and in that he was talking about the priority of air. And how, nothing will function if we don't have clean air. So that's what I would say. What about you?
Excellent.
I'm gonna bounce off that. Another topic that David Suzuki mentioned was us, and for humans to back off a little bit. Just maybe take a step back. I don't know. What is it?
That is a spoiler from David Suzuki. So yeah, I mean, wildlife, they do need air. They need water. They need food. They need places to raise their young. They need places to hide from predators. And this is just, it's habitat. And if you look out your window right now, like whatever you're seeing, even if it's a brick wall, it used to be habitat. So what we need to do is really make sure us, David Suzuki, great answer, that we as humans are having as little impact on their habitat as possible, or maybe even restoring their habitat and just giving wildlife a chance. Right, a chance to raise their young and hunt and feed and be thriving.
Yeah, you've mentioned that it's not going well. Are there any wildlife or nature that's been taken off the endangered list, or it's looking any better for?
You know what? There are wildlife that have actually their populations have sprung back. We look at some, especially some bird species that are doing much better. Lots of people will go to peregrine falcon as an example, and that's because we got rid of pesticides that made their shells too thin, so that their young weren't surviving. But it's really interesting because any wildlife that actually is doing well or recovering, it's because, David Suzuki, because of us, because we've intervened with conservation actions, because we've said, oh, wait a minute, we can do this. What are the threats facing this species? And how do we remove those threats? And a lot of those threats do come down to habitat, their habitat being clean and safe and there to support them for survival.
Gotcha. Okay, can you explain the three main goals of Regenerate Canada?
Yeah, so at WWF Canada, we have this 10-year plan to regenerate Canada. And back to that question of what do wildlife need? Well, we are working to protect 100 million hectares of habitat. People are listening, not watching, but you guys, your eyes just got big. It's a lot. We're slightly panicked about it, but it's what we need to work on. So we're doing it. So 100 million hectares of habitat protected. And then where we've degraded habitat, we want to restore 1 million hectares of habitat. And at the same time, hey, climate change is one of the biggest threats facing humans and facing wildlife today. So how can we use nature to fight climate change? So while we're protecting habitat, we're looking at that ecosystem carbon, using some scientific words here, but what is the carbon that's locked up in those landscapes and seascapes? Can we actually prevent greenhouse gas emissions through nature? Nature absorbing carbon, nature storing carbon. So we're looking at 30 megatons of carbon that we can actually avoid going into the atmosphere just by using nature. So big goals, but 10 years, and this is really what wildlife needs. So we're excited to be working on it.
What are some of the people doing on the ground? Like what is the work involved in some of these restoration projects? Because we hear this, but like that is a massive project.
Yeah, these are big projects. So let me give you an example, working with Katzie First Nation out in BC. So Katzie believe that their tradition, they believe that salmon are their ancestors. And as you probably know, salmon are in trouble in BC. And they have all of these streams and water courses in their territory that have been degraded through forestry practices. And that might be counterintuitive. It's like, how's forestry involved in this? Well, when you're cutting down trees, think about trees, like their roots kind of hold the earth in place, right? So when you cut down those trees, there's nothing holding the earth together. And so you end up with landslides across streams. Sometimes when you're going to cut down trees across the other side of a river, they'll make a temporary road. Well, that cuts off the salmon spawning stream. So working with Katzie, we've been restoring those streams, some of those water courses, by planting plants, planting trees. There's been a little bit of construction of moving those landslide, the debris out of the way, and then putting plants in place so their roots can hold the earth in place. It is amazing work. And the first year we just did this little stream, right? But the next year, there were salmon spawning in that stream. I don't want to overstate it. It wasn't like, tens of thousands, but like just to see salmon back in that stream, what meant the world to us, meant the world to Katzie First Nation. And it shows you that like we can do this. There are solutions.
Is it things like that are the top priority for this land restoration, or are there other things that really take priority when doing all of this?
Yeah, well, if I go back to the numbers of 100 million hectares protected, that's a really big number. Restoration it's a little more intense, so we have a smaller number for that, 1 million hectares. For protection, we're looking at big tracts of land. I mean, if you think about where humans are and where they have degraded lands, we actually do have lands and waters in Canada that are pretty healthy and sustaining wildlife. So can we protect those areas from industrial development and other impacts? We're working with Inuit in this area called Aviktuk. And if you can picture the landmass of Canada, and the Arctic is a lot of islands, this is the furthest north on the mainland before you hit all these islands, Aviktuk. And we're working with hunters and trappers there. And you might be like, that's a weird alliance. But the Talojoak Hunters and Trappers Association, they want protection for their lands and waters. And they want protection for walrus and caribou and narwhal and seabirds. And for them, it's about the hunt. It's about the culture of the hunt. It's about passing down knowledge about caribou migration from generation to generation. It's about food security. It's about language, because if you lose a species like caribou and the word tuktu, then like you're not using that word anymore, and the fabric of your culture is fraying. So we're working with them, and they are asking for protection, going to the federal government and saying, we are the people of this territory. We want to see it protected for future generations and for the wildlife. So it might almost seem like an unlikely alliance, but it's such a privilege to work with them and to do whatever we can at WWF to advance protection in that area.
To expand on that, if you visit the WWF Canada website, there's so much work being done with Indigenous-led conservation.
Yeah.
Talk about the role that plays in the success of achieving the 3 goals of Regenerate Canada.
Look, here's some real talk. Conservation organizations haven't always had the best track record in working with Indigenous peoples. And if you think about the history of protection of land in Canada, sometimes we've protected land so that we have a place to go skiing. It hasn't been for wildlife. And sometimes we've done it in a way where we've actually kicked First Peoples off the land and said, this land is so important that we can't let anybody on it. Which you're shaking your heads like that is an old way of thinking. Okay.
Right.
That is obviously not the way we think about these things anymore. But at WWF Canada, we thought a lot about, well, what's our role in reconciliation? And can we use conservation as a tool for reconciliation? How do we do that? And the only way to do it is to support the incredible work that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities are doing in conservation. They have Indigenous knowledge passed down from generation to generation about these ecosystems. They know what these ecosystems need. So, at WWF, we've got people who know GIS and they can do mapping, or we've got people who know how to write letters to the prime minister, or people who know how to write funding proposals. Like what tools do we have to support that incredible work? We'll do a Facebook post, like whatever. It might seem really simple, but that work that's being led by Indigenous communities is key. And then it's up to all of us to ask, well, how do we support that? Sometimes it means money, right? That is the best way that we can support that work. So it's an honor. It's an honor to be able to support Indigenous-led conservation in Canada.
Yeah. What can individuals do like us? Like what can everyday people who feel like they don't have a lot of power?
What, you're not going to plant a forest?
We'll try our
Well,
best.
you know what? A great thing that people can do that actually is like planting a forest. I listened to your podcast where you were talking about prescriptions for getting out in nature. So this will appeal to folks who liked that episode. A native species, okay, like a purple coneflower or a black-eyed Susan, right? We know that the circle of life works. A little bird comes or a butterfly comes and pollinates, and then the bird might scatter the seeds, and then the butterfly might be food for a bird, which is okay. And the seeds that are scattered might create some shrubs for a family of bunnies. And like, this is how the circle of life works. Planting one black-eyed Susan is not going to save the earth, right? But what if, you plant one and you plant one and I plant one and my neighbors plant one? All of a sudden, we're getting a bit of critical mass here. So at WWF Canada, if you go to our website, we have a program called Regrow, like restore or recycle. This is Regrow. Just pop it in your search engine. And you can see where people are doing these actions across Canada. And if you want to plant that black-eyed Susan, you can put in and it shows up on the map, and we can actually track actions across Canada. And so far we've had over 1 million actions, right? And back to this idea of like one plant, but no, it's all of a sudden it's 1 million, you know? So regrow is a great way for people to get involved. If you don't have a yard, you can do it at your kid's schoolyard. You can do it at your church or your mosque. You can do it in front of your workplace. And pollinators can get up to 7 stories. So you can do it on your balcony. Like, this all adds up. And if you, again, look out the window, this used to be habitat. So what can I do to make that habitat again? You know, it all starts with one plant.
And by the way, black-eyed Susans are so beautiful. So
Oh, I know.
we'll never complain about seeing a black-eyed Susan.
No, never.
Now, before we let you go, you mentioned carbon storage. I don't think that's a common thing that all of us know what that means. So when you're talking about carbon stores within these projects, what does that mean?
So we kind of learned in school about how trees, you know, when we were kids, we were kind of told they breathe in carbon dioxide and they breathe out oxygen, you know, in really, in simple kid terms. By and large, that's true. But it's not just trees. It's like every plant you can think of. It's kelp and seaweed. It's shrubs and grasses. And then that carbon is not just in their leaves, it's in their stems and their roots. Those roots are in the soil. So all of a sudden soil is storing carbon. Like, it's bananas how much healthy soil is rich in carbon. And so when we go in and let's say we drain a wetland because we want to build a shopping mall, or we cut down a forest for housing development, that carbon that is locked in those trees and roots and shrubs, it gets converted into carbon dioxide. It goes up into the atmosphere. Globally, 30% of the world's greenhouse gases come from the destruction of nature. So if that is true, the opposite is true. So back to this idea of planting that black-eyed Susan, again, one's not going to save the world, but if we can plant more plants, if we can protect the ecosystems that store carbon, let's protect those. But can we actually plant and restore ecosystems so it's habitat for wildlife, but it's also drawing in that carbon? It's like this incredible win-win. And then you can get a prescription to go out in nature and have the added health benefits. Like, it's just, nature is truly such a win.
Amazing. Thank you
so much for your time.
Well, happy Earth Day party.
That was Megan Leslie, President, CEO of WWF Canada. Again, Earth Day Party, Virgin Radio's Earth Day Party. This is our first annual and is totally in support of WWF Canada.
Yeah, I'm so glad that they jumped on board for this, and that we can also not only help educate people, and I'm learning myself, but also direct people to donate too.
Well, in that interview, Shannon, you asked a really good question, a very inspiring question about some of the biodiversity and wildlife that they've been able to save and take off the endangered list thanks to their work. But we thought we could highlight some of the other animals that WWF Canada are fighting for.
Yeah, so we're going to get into some of the profiles on their website that are highlighting different animals. I feel like we're all quite familiar with the fact that polar bears are not doing so great these days. We've seen the photos of them looking very skinny on the shrinking ice caps.
So why are polar bears important?
Okay, so being at the top of the food web, polar bears can signal that there are problems in the Arctic marine ecosystem, and they are likely to be among the most significantly affected species as the Arctic continues to warm and the sea ice melts. So their future is not looking too good because everything around them is melting. And the WWF Canada, they're supporting polar bear studies that help determine the number of bears, their health, and the state of the sea ice habitat.
You know what that reminds me of? When we spoke with Natalie Knowles from Protect Our Winters Canada, just that snow being kind of our visual representation of what is happening to our planet as a result of the climate emergency. Polar bears are feeling the brunt of it and are kind of our canary in the coal mine in a weird way. I'm sure every animal is the canary in the coal mine, but polar bears are more of a blunt visual representation.
Yeah, and that's probably why we recognize them as endangered more than other animals that are probably more endangered than even they are. So
well, one we heard about in the past few years here in Canada that has really stood out is the monarch butterfly.
Yes.
A symbol of Canada, a crucial pollinator, and you may have heard by now that it's endangered.
Why are they important, Sarah?
Well, we need pollinators. That's how our plants grow. That's how our vegetables, our fruits grow. we need them because without pollinators, we won't really have food available. But monarch butterflies, they're threatened by deforestation of wintering forests in Mexico. That's where they go when the weather gets cold, disruptions to their migration caused by climate change, and loss of native plants along their path. So WWF Canada is working along that migration path to conserve their habitat. So like Megan Leslie mentioned, planting those native plants. Monarch butterflies love all kinds of milkweed. So if you're listening to this, thinking about your garden, milkweed. Do you have any room for that?
Amazing. And then there's the North Atlantic right whale, which is one of the most endangered large whale species on the planet. There's only about 400 that are left. So back in the 1800s, they were actually hunted near extinction. So now the biggest threat is them getting tangled up in fishing gear, different plastics, or being hit by a fishing boat. So WWF Canada, they're working with governments and industry to improve the development, developing new management measures to better protect the species because there are just so little of them left.
So these are just a few examples of what our donations support when we donate to WWF Canada, protecting wildlife that are threatened by our changing climate and are vital to a surviving planet.
Yeah, so it's a very educational website too if you want to go on WWF's website just to read more about that. And then, go donate too if you can. If you got a few extra dollars floating around that you can put towards our country and our planet.
Literally anything helps. If you spend $3, $4 on a coffee, maybe today instead of doing that $3 or $4 can go towards supporting and protecting wildlife. WWF.ca/Earth Month.
Thanks so much for listening. I'm Shannon.
And I'm Sarah, and thank you so much for coming out to the Earth Day party.
Earth Day Party podcast is in support of WWF Canada. Help protect wildlife and fight climate change during Earth Month with a gift to WWF Canada. You can give now at WWF.ca/Earth Month.